Picture this. It's 1200 BCE, and you're standing on the walls of Ugarit, one of the most prosperous trading cities in the ancient world. Ships loaded with precious cargo dot the harbor. Merchants from across the Mediterranean haggle in a dozen languages, and life seems as stable as the massive stone foundations beneath your feet. But then, on the horizon, you spot something that makes your blood run cold. Strange ships with bird-headed prows cutting through the waves, carrying warriors wearing horned helmets, unlike anything you've ever seen. Within days, your thriving city will be nothing but ash and rubble. And the killers? They came from nowhere, left no trace of their origins, and vanished into history as mysteriously as they appeared. These weren't ordinary raiders or conquering armies. These were the Sea Peoples, a confederation of unknown tribes who emerged from the shadows of history to bring down some of the most powerful civilizations the world had ever known. And here's what makes their story absolutely mind-bending. Despite causing one of the most catastrophic collapses in human history, we still have no idea who they actually were. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of archaeology's greatest unsolved mysteries. A story so bizarre that it sounds like fiction, but the evidence is carved in stone across the ruins of ancient empires. We're talking about seafaring warriors who appeared out of nowhere, around 1200 BCE, shattered the Bronze Age world, and then disappeared just as suddenly, leaving behind only questions that have tormented historians for over 150 years. But before we uncover the shocking truth about these phantom invaders, let me paint you a picture of just how incredible the world was before they arrived. Because to understand the magnitude of what the Sea Peoples destroyed, you need to see what they were up against. Imagine a world more interconnected than you might think possible for the ancient era. We're talking about the late Bronze Age, a time when the Eastern Mediterranean wasn't a collection of isolated kingdoms, but a sophisticated network of superpowers that would make modern globalization look simple. The borders were essentially open from Egypt to Persia, from the Black Sea to the Red Sea. Trade flowed like water, diplomacy was an art form, and cultural exchange happened on a scale that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. At the heart of this world sat the major players. And trust me, these weren't primitive civilizations scratching out a living in the dirt. Egypt's new kingdom was at its absolute peak, with pharaohs like Ramesses II commanding resources that would make modern nations jealous. The Hittite Empire controlled vast swaths of Anatolia and Syria, fielding armies that could go toe-to-toe with anyone. Mycenaean Greece was flourishing, with palace complexes so grand that later Greeks would think they were built by giants. And connecting them all was a web of trade routes that carried everything from Afghan tin to Lebanese cedar to Egyptian gold. Here's what's absolutely fascinating. These kingdoms didn't just trade goods, they traded ideas, technologies, even royal marriages. We have actual letters between these ancient kings, and they address each other as equals, as brothers. The Amarna letters, discovered in Egypt, read like diplomatic cables between modern world leaders, discussing everything from trade disputes to marriage negotiations to military alliances. But here's the kicker: this entire sophisticated system depended on one crucial element that would prove to be its fatal weakness: bronze. The Bronze Age wasn't just named after the metal, it was built on it. Every weapon, every tool, every piece of technology that mattered was made from bronze. And bronze requires two specific metals, copper and tin. Copper was relatively easy to find, especially from places like Cyprus. But tin? That was the rare ingredient, sourced from places as far away as Afghanistan or even Britain. Think about what that means. To keep this Bronze Age world running, you needed trade networks spanning thousands of miles, crossing deserts, mountains, and seas. You needed political stability across multiple kingdoms, secure shipping lanes, and diplomatic relationships that could weather any storm. It was an incredibly sophisticated system, but also incredibly fragile. like a house of cards waiting for the right gust of wind to bring it all crashing down. And that wind was about to come in the form of mysterious warriors from the sea. Now, before we meet these enigmatic invaders, you need to understand just how shocking their appearance was to the ancient world. The Sea Peoples weren't just another migrating tribe or ambitious kingdom looking to expand their territory. They were something entirely different, a coalition of groups that seemed to materialize out of thin air, with no clear homeland, no diplomatic history, and no apparent interest in the rules of Bronze Age warfare. The first hint of trouble came around 1207 BCE during the reign of Egyptian pharaoh Meneptah. Carved into stone at his mortuary temple is what might be the earliest reference to these mysterious peoples. The inscription mentions several groups with strange names: the Shurdan, the Shekelesh, the Ekwesh, the Luka, and the Teresh. But here's the eerie part. The inscription describes them as coming from the distant sea, but gives no indication of where that might actually be. These weren't isolated raiders. The evidence suggests a massive, coordinated movement of peoples, and not just warriors either. When archaeologists study the reliefs depicting Sea Peoples' battles, they see something unprecedented: ox-drawn carts loaded with women and children following behind the warriors. This wasn't conquest for the sake of plunder. This was migration on an epic scale, entire populations on the move, carrying everything they owned and desperately seeking new lands to call home. But what could drive such a massive displacement of peoples? What force could be so devastating that it would uproot entire civilizations and send them wandering across the Mediterranean in search of new homes? The answer lies in one of the most catastrophic environmental disasters of the ancient world. Recent scientific analysis has revealed that around 1200 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean was hit by what researchers call a megadrought, a climate catastrophe that lasted anywhere from 150 to 300 years. Core samples taken from the Sea of Galilee show that this period was the driest of the entire Bronze Age. We're talking about crop failures on a massive scale, widespread famine, and the collapse of agricultural systems that had supported civilizations for centuries. Imagine the desperation. Entire regions that had been fertile for generations suddenly couldn't support their populations. Traditional power structures crumbled as people faced starvation. And somewhere in this chaos, groups of survivors banded together, took to their ships, and decided that if they couldn't make it where they were, they'd find somewhere else to live, even if it meant taking it by force. But the Sea Peoples weren't just desperate refugees with farming tools. When they finally appeared in the historical record, they came as a sophisticated military force that would revolutionize ancient warfare. Their ships featured innovations that Egyptian artists had never seen before: vessels with bird-headed prows, and what appears to be new sail technology that gave them unprecedented mobility on the water. Their land forces were equally impressive. The warriors wore distinctive horned helmets that made them instantly recognizable on ancient battlefields. They carried round shields and fought with a combination of spears, swords, and tactics that proved devastatingly effective against traditional Bronze Age armies. Some groups even used three-man chariots instead of the standard two-man Egyptian design, giving them numerical superiority in mobile warfare. What made them truly terrifying wasn't just their military prowess, it was their unpredictability. Traditional Bronze Age warfare followed certain rules. Kingdoms would send diplomatic envoys, make demands, negotiate terms. The Sea Peoples did none of this. They appeared without warning, struck with overwhelming force, and disappeared just as quickly. No one knew where they would hit next, what they wanted beyond survival, or how to negotiate with an enemy that seemed to have no permanent homeland. The psychological impact was devastating. Ancient rulers who had grown comfortable managing traditional diplomatic and military threats suddenly found themselves facing an enemy that operated by completely different rules. How do you negotiate with nomadic warriors who have nothing to lose? How do you defend against an enemy whose homeland you can't identify or attack in return? The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape the ancient world forever. The first major power to face the full fury of the Sea Peoples was the mighty Hittite Empire, and what happened next would send shockwaves across the ancient world. Picture the Hittites at their peak, masters of iron technology, controllers of crucial trade routes, builders of massive fortified cities that seemed absolutely impregnable. Their capital at Hattusa was protected by walls so thick and high that enemies would take one look and march away. This was an empire that had fought Egypt to a standstill and forced the pharaohs to sign history's first known peace treaty. But around 1180 BCE, something impossible happened. The Hittite Empire simply vanished. Not conquered in some epic final battle, not slowly declining over generations just gone. Archaeological evidence shows massive destruction layers at site after site, followed by complete abandonment. It's like an entire civilization just packed up and walked away from everything they'd built over centuries. Here's where it gets really unsettling. We have Hittite records right up until the end, and they're frantically requesting military aid from their allies, reporting strange ships off their coasts, describing attacks by unknown enemies. Then, silence. Complete historical silence. The last Hittite king disappears from the record, the royal archives go dark, and one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world becomes a ghost story. The Sea Peoples were just getting started. Moving south along the coast, their next target was the prosperous trading city of Ugarit. Now, Ugarit wasn't just some backwater port. This was essentially the New York City of the Bronze Age. Ships from across the known world docked at its harbors. Its merchants spoke a dozen languages and dealt in everything from Baltic amber to Indian spices. The city had survived wars, political upheavals, and economic crashes for centuries. Its massive walls and strategic location made it seem untouchable. But we have something from Ugarit that's absolutely chilling, the last letters ever sent from the city. Picture this. You're reading correspondence that was literally interrupted by the apocalypse. One letter, sent to the King of Cyprus, reads like a frantic SOS. My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Another message, even more desperate. The enemy advances against us, and there is no number to them. Our food in the threshing floors was burned, and the vineyards were also destroyed. All our troops and chariots are in the Hittite country, and all our ships are in the land of Lucca. They have not arrived back yet, and thus the country waits in distress. These aren't military reports, they're death screams carved in clay. And then, just like with the Hittites, silence. Ugarit burned to the ground and was never rebuilt. The last letters were found still sitting on scribes' desks, as if the writers simply dropped their styluses and ran. But the Sea Peoples weren't done. Their rampage continued across the eastern Mediterranean like a plague of destruction. Mycenaean Greece, the civilization that would later inspire Homer's tales of heroic warriors, crumbled under their assault. Massive palace complexes that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. The sophisticated bureaucratic system that had managed everything from taxation to religious festivals simply collapsed overnight. What's absolutely mind-bending is the scale of this devastation. We're talking about the simultaneous collapse of multiple major civilizations across thousands of miles of territory. It's like watching the modern world's major powers, the United States, China, Europe, all falling apart at exactly the same time. The odds of this happening naturally are astronomical. And yet, despite causing this unprecedented catastrophe, the Sea Peoples themselves remain complete mysteries. They left behind no writings in their own language, no monuments proclaiming their victories, no clear archaeological signature that would tell us who they were, or where they came from. It's as if they were ghosts made real just long enough to destroy everything, then faded back into myth. The only detailed accounts we have come from their final target, Egypt, and what happened there would determine not just the fate of the pharaohs, but the entire future of the ancient world. By the time the Sea Peoples reached Egypt around 1175 BCE, they had already shattered every major power in their path. But Pharaoh Ramesses III wasn't about to go down without a fight. Unlike his neighbors who seemed caught completely off guard, Ramesses had time to prepare. He'd heard the reports of burning cities, fleeing refugees, and mysterious fleets devastating everything in their path, and he was ready. The Egyptian records of what happened next read like something out of an action movie. Ramesses didn't just wait for the Sea Peoples to attack. He set a trap that would make military historians drool with envy. The pharaoh assembled his fleet in the mouth of the Nile Delta, positioning his ships to look vulnerable while secretly preparing the most devastating ambush in naval history. When the Sea Peoples fleet sailed into the Delta, expecting another easy victory, they found themselves sailing into a nightmare. Egyptian archers lined the shores like a wall of death, while the pharaoh's war fleet emerged from hidden positions to cut off any escape route. The battle scenes carved into the walls of Medinet Habu show absolute carnage. Sea Peoples warriors drowning as their ships capsized, survivors being dragged to shore only to face Egyptian executioners. But here's what makes this victory so significant. It wasn't just a military triumph. It was the moment when one of history's greatest mysteries crystallized forever. Because after their defeat at the hands of Ramesses III, the Sea Peoples simply vanished from history as completely as they had appeared. Some groups, like the Peliset, who became the biblical Philistines, settled in conquered territories and gradually assimilated into local populations. But the majority, gone. No trace, no records, no archaeological evidence of where they went or what happened to them. The aftermath of their rampage had reshaped the entire ancient world. The sophisticated Bronze Age civilization that had flourished for centuries was finished. Trade networks that had connected continents lay in ruins. Written languages disappeared, technological knowledge was lost, and entire regions plunged into what historians call a dark age that would last for centuries. From the ashes of this collapse, entirely new civilizations would eventually emerge. The Phoenicians expanded into territories once controlled by greater powers, spreading their alphabet across the Mediterranean. The Greeks who survived the Mycenaean collapse would eventually create the classical civilization we know today. Iron technology, once carefully guarded by the Hittites, spread rapidly as the Old Order crumbled, ushering in the Iron Age. But the central mystery remains as baffling today as it was 3,000 years ago. Who were the Sea Peoples? Modern scholars have proposed dozens of theories: refugees from natural disasters, displaced tribes from the collapsing Mycenaean world, even invaders from beyond the Mediterranean entirely. Some see them as symptoms of the Bronze Age collapse rather than its cause, part of a perfect storm of climate change, political instability, and economic disruption. Yet none of these theories can fully explain the evidence. How could a group powerful enough to destroy multiple empires leave behind virtually no trace of their own culture? How could warriors sophisticated enough to revolutionize naval warfare and military tactics vanish so completely from the archaeological record? How could entire populations migrate across the Mediterranean without leaving clear evidence of where they started their journey? The Sea Peoples challenge everything we think we know about how history works. They're like a massive blank space in the ancient world's story, a shadow that touched everything but left no footprints of its own. And here's where things get really strange, because the more archaeologists dig, the more questions they uncover, instead of answers. Take the Shurden, for example, one of the most frequently mentioned Sea Peoples groups. Egyptian records show they first appeared as enemies, then somehow ended up serving as elite bodyguards for the very pharaohs they had once attacked. How does that happen? How do you go from being a mortal threat to becoming trusted protectors of the royal family? The archaeological evidence is equally baffling. At sites across the Mediterranean, excavators find destruction layers that match the timeline of Sea People's attacks. But here's the weird part. The artifacts don't match. You'd expect to find foreign weapons, pottery, jewelry, something that would scream, "These are the people who did this." Instead, you find local materials destroyed by techniques that don't match local warfare patterns. It's like finding a crime scene where everything was destroyed by methods that don't exist in your forensics handbook. Even more puzzling is what happened to the survivors in the regions they conquered. DNA analysis of ancient remains from places like Ashkelon, where the Philistines settled, shows clear evidence of European genetic markers appearing suddenly in the population around 1200 BCE. These weren't gradual migrations. They were massive population replacements that happened within a single generation. Entire communities that had existed for centuries were suddenly dominated by people with completely different genetic backgrounds. But if these were such massive migrations, where are the origin points? Where did all these people come from? You can't move entire populations across the Mediterranean without leaving some trace of where they started. Yet, despite decades of searching, archaeologists have found no clear homeland for any of the Sea People's groups. No abandoned cities that would explain where the Shurden originated. No empty territories that would account for the massive Philistine migration. It's as if these people materialized out of thin air. The technology they brought with them adds another layer to the mystery. The horned helmets worn by Sea People's warriors weren't just decorative, they represented sophisticated metalworking techniques that were more advanced than anything being produced in the regions they attacked. Their ships featured design innovations that wouldn't appear again in Mediterranean naval architecture for centuries. They introduced new sword designs that were so effective they were immediately copied by local populations. Where did they learn to build these things? Advanced metallurgy and shipbuilding don't develop overnight. They require generations of accumulated knowledge, specialized craftsmen, and access to raw materials. Yet the Sea Peoples appeared with fully developed technologies that seemed to have no evolutionary history in the archaeological record. The linguistic evidence is equally frustrating. The names we have for these groups, Shurden, Shekelesh, Peliset, come entirely from Egyptian sources. We don't know what these people called themselves. We don't have a single word in their own language. For a confederation powerful enough to destroy empires, they left behind no inscriptions, no written records, no monuments proclaiming their achievements. It's unprecedented in ancient history. Consider what this means. Every other major ancient civilization, from the Mesopotamians to the Greeks to the Romans, left behind extensive written records. They told their own stories, recorded their victories, preserved their histories for future generations. The Sea Peoples did none of this. Either they had no written language, which seems impossible given their sophisticated military and naval organization, or they deliberately chose to leave no trace of their own narrative. Some researchers have proposed that the Sea Peoples weren't a single coordinated invasion, but rather multiple waves of refugees fleeing different disasters across the Mediterranean. This would explain why they appear to have come from multiple directions and why their equipment and tactics varied between groups. But even this theory has problems. How did these disparate refugee groups develop such effective coordination? How did they maintain military discipline during what must have been desperate circumstances? The climate data adds another wrinkle to the puzzle. While the megadrought certainly created conditions for mass migration, it doesn't explain the Sea People's military effectiveness. Starving refugees don't typically develop revolutionary naval technologies or sophisticated battle tactics. They don't coordinate multi-front campaigns across thousands of miles of territory. The level of organization required for the Sea People's rampage suggests something much more complex than simple climate-driven migration. Recent underwater archaeology has revealed tantalizing clues but no clear answers. Shipwrecks from the late Bronze Age period show evidence of violent destruction, but the cargo patterns are weird. You'd expect to find personal possessions if these were refugee ships, or military equipment if they were invasion fleets. Instead, you find mixed cargoes that don't fit any clear pattern, luxury goods mixed with basic supplies, weapons alongside farming tools, religious artifacts from multiple cultures all jumbled together. It's like someone took everything valuable from multiple civilizations, threw it all together, and then lost it at sea. But who would do that? And why? The human cost of the Sea People's rampage becomes even more staggering when you consider what was lost forever. The Library of Ugarit, for instance, contained thousands of tablets in multiple languages, diplomatic correspondence, literary works, religious texts, scientific observations. When the city burned, centuries of accumulated knowledge went up in smoke. The same pattern repeated across the region. Centers of learning, artistic traditions, technological innovations, all wiped out in a matter of decades. But here's what's really haunting about this destruction. It wasn't random. The Sea Peoples seemed to target the most important sites in each region they attacked. They didn't just raid coastal settlements, they went after the political, economic, and cultural centers that held entire civilizations together. This suggests intelligence gathering, strategic planning, and a level of understanding about their targets that goes far beyond opportunistic raiding. How did nomadic warriors develop such detailed knowledge of Bronze Age power structures? How did they know which cities to attack to cause maximum disruption? How did they coordinate simultaneous strikes across multiple regions? These aren't the actions of desperate refugees stumbling around the Mediterranean looking for new homes. This was systematic, strategic warfare conducted by people who understood exactly how to bring down complex civilizations. The psychological warfare aspect is equally sophisticated. The Sea People's reputation preceded them wherever they went, spreading terror that often did more damage than their actual attacks. Cities surrendered without fighting. Entire populations fled at the mere rumor of their approach. This kind of psychological dominance doesn't happen by accident. It requires deliberate cultivation of fear and reputation management that would make modern military strategists proud. Yet despite all this evidence of sophisticated planning and execution, we still can't answer the most basic questions about who these people were. Every lead ends in frustration. Every theory hits a wall of missing evidence. The Sea Peoples remain as mysterious today as they were to the ancient Egyptians who first recorded theirs. Perhaps that's the most names. An unsettling aspect of their entire story. In our modern world of satellites and databases and DNA analysis, we like to think that every historical mystery can eventually be solved. That with enough research and technology, we can uncover the truth about any ancient civilization. The Sea Peoples challenge that assumption. They represent a hole in history that may never be filled, a reminder that some secrets of the ancient world might be lost forever. But their impact on human civilization is undeniable. The collapse they triggered wasn't just the end of the Bronze Age, it was the birth of the world we know today. From the ashes of their destruction came alphabetic writing, iron technology, democratic government, philosophical inquiry, and countless other innovations that define Western civilization. In destroying the old order, the Sea Peoples inadvertently created the conditions for everything that followed. So, who were they really? Warriors? Refugees? Revolutionary agents of change? The answer may be all of these, and none of them. The Sea Peoples exist in that liminal space between history and myth, between fact and legend, where the most profound truths about human nature often hide. They represent something far more unsettling than just another ancient mystery. They're proof that entire civilizations can vanish so completely that we're left staring at their absence like archaeologists, trying to reconstruct a dinosaur from a single tooth. And that should terrify us, because it means our own certainties about history, about progress, about the permanence of human achievement might be built on foundations far more fragile than we'd like to admit. Think about what the Sea Peoples actually accomplished. In less than 50 years, they managed to erase empires that had dominated the known world for centuries. The Hittites, who had perfected ironworking and built cities that seemed eternal, reduced to scattered refugees. Mycenaean Greece, with its magnificent palaces and sophisticated bureaucracy, collapsed so completely that the survivors forgot how to write. Trade networks that had connected continents for generations severed permanently. But here's where the story gets even stranger. Because while we're obsessing over who the Sea Peoples were, we might be missing the more important question: what does their success tell us about the civilizations they destroyed? Recent archaeological evidence suggests that the Bronze Age world wasn't as stable as those impressive ruins make it appear. Beneath the surface of all that diplomatic correspondence and international trade, there were cracks forming. Social inequality was reaching breaking points in many regions. Environmental pressures were mounting. Political systems that had worked for centuries were becoming increasingly rigid and unable to adapt to changing conditions. The Sea Peoples didn't just attack random targets, they struck at the exact weak points where these civilizations were most vulnerable. They exploited supply chain dependencies, targeted administrative centers, and disrupted the delicate balance that kept the entire system functioning. It's like they had access to some ancient equivalent of classified intelligence reports detailing exactly how to bring down each empire most efficiently. This raises a chilling possibility that most historians are reluctant to discuss openly. What if the Sea Peoples weren't outsiders at all? What if they were products of the very civilizations they destroyed? Rebels, outcasts, displaced populations who had been systematically marginalized by the Bronze Age power structure, and finally decided to burn it all down. Think about it. Who would know better how to destroy the Hittite Empire than former Hittite subjects who had been driven out by political upheaval or economic collapse? Who would understand Mycenaean defensive weaknesses better than Greek warriors who had once served in those very armies? The sophistication of their attacks, their detailed knowledge of target vulnerabilities, their ability to coordinate across vast distances, all of this makes more sense if they were working from inside information. The genetic evidence from Philistine settlements supports this theory in unexpected ways. While DNA analysis shows clear European markers appearing suddenly in the population, it also reveals something else. These weren't pure foreign populations. The genetic signature suggests mixing between newcomers and existing local populations, but in patterns that indicate the newcomers had some prior connection to the region. They weren't complete strangers, they were coming home. But if that's true, it means the Sea Peoples represent something far more disturbing than foreign invasion. They represent internal collapse, the moment when a civilization's own people decide that the system is so broken, so corrupt, so unsustainable, that the only solution is total destruction. They're not barbarians at the gates, they're the gates opening from within. This interpretation explains why the Sea Peoples vanished so completely after their rampage. They didn't disappear because they were defeated or assimilated. They disappeared because they had accomplished their goal. The old order was dead. The power structures that had oppressed them were in ruins, and they could finally blend back into the populations they had helped liberate. The revolution didn't need leaders anymore because the revolution was complete. Look at what emerged from the ashes of their destruction. The Phoenicians, who had been minor players in the Bronze Age world, suddenly became master traders spanning the Mediterranean. The Greeks developed new forms of government based on broader participation rather than palace bureaucracy. Iron technology, once monopolized by the Hittite elite, spread rapidly and democratically. The alphabet replaced complex writing systems that only scribes could master. Every single one of these developments benefited ordinary people at the expense of traditional elites. The Sea Peoples didn't just destroy the Bronze Age world, they cleared the ground for something more egalitarian to grow in its place. That's not the work of random raiders or desperate refugees. That's revolution. And perhaps that's why the Sea Peoples left behind no monuments to their victories, no inscriptions proclaiming their greatness. no records of their campaigns. Revolutionaries who succeed don't build statues of themselves, they disappear back into the communities they fought to free. Their victory isn't measured in territory conquered or wealth accumulated, but in the simple fact that the old oppressive system no longer exists. The more you examine the evidence through this lens, the more it makes sense. The ox carts full of families following the warriors weren't proof of migration, they were proof of liberation. These were people who had been displaced by the Bronze Age system, finally able to return to lands their ancestors had been driven from. The strange mix of technologies and cultural elements wasn't evidence of different origins, it was evidence of different groups who had been marginalized by the same oppressive system finally working together. The naval innovations, the military tactics, the strategic coordination, all of this could have been developed by displaced populations who had plenty of time to plan while living as refugees or outcasts. When you're systematically excluded from the benefits of civilization, you have strong motivation to figure out how to tear it down. And when multiple excluded groups discover they share the same enemy, cooperation becomes not just possible, but inevitable. In the end, maybe the real mystery isn't who the Sea Peoples were, but what they represent about the fragility of everything we think is permanent. They remind us that even the mightiest civilizations are just one perfect storm away from becoming archaeological puzzles. The Bronze Age world thought it would last forever, until it didn't. And somewhere in that collapse, ordinary people took extraordinary action to reshape their world completely. If this story fascinated you as much as it haunts historians today, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments, what other ancient mysteries should we dive into next? Because history's greatest secrets are still waiting to be uncovered.